Hundreds of Palestinians protested the closing of a space in front of the Damascus gate, while Jewish extremists marched elsewhere, shouting death to Arabs.
2022 was the deadliest year in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories in over a decade, and the violence is only increasing. 80 Palestinians and 14 Israelis were killed in the first 3 months of 2023, while Israel itself has been rocked by street clashes and mass protests.
Bro, how could you live here, bro?
One of the key flashpoints has been the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, where Palestinian families claim that they're being illegally evicted to make way for Jewish settlers, leading to a series of riots and street clashes.
So-called supposed to be peace and all that, but
in October, in the midst of escalating violence, something strange happened. A serving member of the Israeli parliament appeared on the front line of the street conflict, pulled out a gun, and started threatening Palestinian protesters.
Damn! That boy got a gun.
What's even more shocking is that this man wielding a gun has since been named Israel's Minister of National Security, a powerful figure in Israel's recently elected government, probably the most ultra-nationalist in the country's history. This is how the far-right ultra-nationalist politics of Jewish supremacists and militant settlers has made the leap from the streets into the halls of power, threatening the democratic standing of the world's only Jewish state.
That's wild, bruh. Sheesh.
The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is one of the world's most painful and long-running disputes. But in recent times, something seems to be shifting with the growing prominence of Jewish ultra-nationalists. Lahava is an explicitly Jewish supremacist organization whose distinctive uniform has become a common sight at ultra-nationalist rallies across Israel. The group first gained attention by protesting outside the weddings of mixed Jewish-Arab couples, using harassment, intimidation, and sometimes violence to prevent religious assimilation or cultural mixing.
זאת הייתה אמורה להיות חתונה פרטית של בני הזוג, אבל החתונה הזאת מסעירה את המדינה כבר שבוע ימים, בשל כך היא יהודייה והוא ערבי.
But within Israel itself, Lahava's marches have become increasingly violent, targeting non-Jews, mixed couples, and LGBTQ events.
Why do you protest the Pride?
Because the Torah said you need to be straight, you need to be a man with woman.
You're willing to fight for the cause?
To the Jew, to the Torah, to Hashem, and to Eretz Israel, and to Am Israel.
What marks Lahava out is that this is not a movement of the old.
Its
activists are drawn from a new generation of young Israelis who may not even remember the last time there was a functioning peace process with the Palestinians.
So the significance of a far-right group like Lahava primarily being comprised of young people is
Bill Clinton was there.
They really grew up without any connection to what we call the Oslo years. You could almost call them the post-Oslo generation.
This is a whole generation that didn't experience the kind of peer-to-peer contacts that those who grew up in the Oslo years had, who met with Palestinians, who may have even been learning Arabic.
Several Lahava activists have been prosecuted for violence and hate crimes, but the ideological roots of this movement actually go back decades.
This is the sovereign state of Israel, and these damned Arabs here had better learn that if they want to stay here, they'll sit here quietly or get the hell out.
Lahava takes its inspiration from Meir Kahane, an ultra-nationalist leader who advocated absolute Jewish supremacism within Israel.
There is no such thing as an Arab village in the state of Israel. It is a Jewish village that is temporarily inhabited by Arabs.
The Kach movement was founded in Israel in the 1970s. It was ultra-nationalist. It had ethnic and religious supremacist ideals.
First of all, there are no Palestine Arabs. There is no Palestine. There are no Palestinian Arabs.
He managed to gain a seat in the Knesset in 1984 under the banner of his Kach party. This was seen as abhorrent, and mainstream Israel did not respect him as a political figure.
While it was active, Kahane's movement was designated a terrorist organization by the US, and Lahava's leader, Benny Gopstein, was barred from running for Israel's parliament in 2019, largely because of his association with Kahanism.
As time went on, these ideas went underground. They became attractive to youth culture. Some people who had been exposed to these ideas came around to thinking, this guy was right.
But Lahava is far from the only movement drawing inspiration from Kahana's ideology to drum up tensions between Israelis and Palestinians.
יש פה איזה 15 מתנחלים, חלקם רעולי פנים, הורסים פה בית פלסטיני, עוקרים עצים, שורפים שם דברים, והצבא לא עושה כלום לגבי זה.
In the West Bank, which Israel has occupied since 1967, there's been an upsurge in violence between Palestinians and militant Israeli settlers, with the security services often accused of failing to prevent settler violence and shielding the perpetrators.
He showed us videos he'd taken himself of the settler attacks, where you could see youths come down from the settlement above the village to throw stones. The worst thing about it was that they were accompanied by the Israeli army, who were supposedly there to separate the two groups, but were in fact doing nothing to stop the settler attack.
Even people who don't necessarily grow up in a highly ideological settlement are probably trending generationally and otherwise to be more right-wing in their politics. The settlers themselves are really at the front line of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
In February 2023, following the murder of two Israelis, armed settlers went on a rampage through the Palestinian town of Hawara, leaving one dead, hundreds injured, and the town in flames. Violence in the occupied territories has increased since 2016, in tandem with the settlers' increased political influence.
When Trump was elected, the Israeli far-right celebrated wildly. He continues to be very, very popular in Israel because he just handed the country a whole slate of diplomatic victories. But it did just give the sense that there was one less check against Israeli abuses, particularly in the occupied territories, than there had been before.
Which brings us back to the Israeli government minister who was waving a gun around in Sheikh Jarrah, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Ben-Gvir is an ultra-nationalist settler extremist. In November 2022, he was appointed Israel's Minister of National Security.
He supports relaxing open-fire rules against Palestinian rioters and wants security forces to be immune from criminal prosecution.
In 2007, he was convicted of incitement to racism and supporting a terrorist organization.
Ben-Gvir also got his political start in the Kahanist movement. As a teenager, he was rejected for service in the Israeli army for being too extreme. This is the same guy who's now in charge of Israel's national security.
The track record stands, and he was charged and convicted of several offenses related to participation in terrorist organization.
Even a few years ago, it would have been unthinkable for someone as extreme as Ben-Gvir, who's been not just accused but convicted of racial incitement, to become part of an Israeli cabinet. Many have pointed to his rise as the clearest indication of how much Israeli politics and society has lurched to the right, prompting concerns over exactly what this means for minorities and the state of Israeli democracy.
קוראים לעצמם פלסטינים, אין באמת עם כזה, זה לא היה, אין באמת דבר כזה, יש ערבים.
So when you have a far-right ideologue who does not believe that Palestinians have a right to exist, the scope of what he can punish them with in terms of deploying his police forces is pretty frightening to imagine.
But there's a twist in this story. A lot of it actually comes down to the political fortunes and alleged crimes of one man, Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu is Israel's longest-serving prime minister and its dominant political figure of the modern era. But in 2021, he lost power following multiple indictments for high-level corruption.
Israel's Attorney General has just unveiled charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in 3 separate ongoing corruption investigations.
Man, of course.
The repeated elections over the past few years have been almost exclusively about keeping Netanyahu in power and out of possible jail time on his various corruption charges.
Despite this, Netanyahu managed to cobble together a political deal with fringe religious and ultra-nationalist parties, including Ben-Gvir's, which was able to bring him back to power.
Tens of thousands of protesters are once again hitting the streets in Israel as the country enters the 10th week of mass protests over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plan to overhaul the judicial system.
These are people who previously were at the absolute fringes of Israeli politics.
The most right-wing cabinet in this country's history wants to strip the Supreme Court of the authority to veto laws that judges deem unfit.
There's been a sentiment very strongly within the ultra-nationalist community that the High Court of Israel is an entirely secular, biased institution that doesn't believe in the religious values of the state. A lot of this is happening from the mainstreaming of the ideology that's against the High Court.
These proposals are so extreme that they've sparked an unprecedented reaction from Israeli society. Over the past few months, more than 500,000 protesters have poured onto the streets.
Growing turmoil in Israel, fiery protests erupting in the streets tonight. This comes just hours after embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu dismissed his defense minister.
A large number, actually, of Israeli military reservists who basically said if these judicial overhaul plans aren't put on hold, it's going to destroy Israeli democracy, and we don't want to serve in a military that is not part of a democracy.
It now seems as if the Netanyahu-Ben Gvir coalition has been forced to back away from its plans to attack the Supreme Court. But the situation remains extremely volatile. With a rising tide of violence on both sides of the conflict with the Palestinians and extremists like Ben Gvir now at the heart of government, the prospects for Israeli democracy, let alone a functioning peace process, are looking bleak.